3 minutes past, we'll make a bit of a start, if that's all right. So welcome to our February 2026 HAILIE session. We've got Rob Rowland with us here today, talking about evidence and how we measure. So ChatGPT has just written me a little summary of Rob, so I've just copy-pasted his LinkedIn into ChatGPT and told it to make a little summary, so here we go. I do know Rob personally as well, so this summary is all right. Dr. Rob Rowland is a researcher, coach, and editor who helps organizations to turn curiosity into decisions, focusing on research quality over volume. Since 2019, he's run Rob Rowland's research, coaching, and training teams to shape better questions or run or better manage the research they need. He brings senior experience from the University of Warwick's Resilient Cities Laboratory and the University of Birmingham, where he led major commission projects and taught research methods, alongside ongoing roles with networks including Cube Thinking and the Disruptive Innovators Network. Is that acceptable there, Rob?
I think so, yeah. I can sum it up in 3 words. I'm the curator of curiosity.
Beautiful.
And hopefully today I will demonstrate why curiosity is of value to you, particularly around AI.
Cool. Take it away, Rob.
Over from here. Okay, right. So that guy's asked me to. So thanks for asking me to come along today. Guy asked me to speak to you about evidence and why this is important. It's one of my big bugbears, particularly in the housing sector, is around evidence, and we'll get hopefully over the course of the next kind of half an hour, 40 minutes. I'll illustrate why it's my big bugbear and why you should be paying more attention to it in a much more effective and useful way. I'm just going to start off because I know you were all kind of interested in AI in housing, and you're all at various stages of adoption of this. I'm currently doing some work for the Disruptive Innovators Network, where we will be running a pulse about AI adoption and how it's landing amongst housing providers, particularly around the kind of cultural and people sides of that. So it's, there's a lot of unknowns. I know that. I'll include myself on that. This time last year, I probably used ChatGPT once or twice to tidy up a few paragraphs on my website. Now, through a kind of process of trial and error, and learning as I've been going along, I've started to use it much more effectively in the work that I do. I also start to understand kind of where it falls down, what guardrails I need to put in place. And that is a process of gathering evidence. There's no formalized evaluation framework that I've used here, but it's been gathering evidence all the way along, so that I've learned along the way. So just so I can't see everybody online, but I'm just going to get a flavour, and I'm going to throw out what feel like, to me, rhetorical questions, but I want you to reflect on them as we move through this morning. So how many of you are running trials in your organisation around AI type things? The one I hear quite a lot of is we're running a pilot on Copilot, which is very difficult to kind of say, isn't it? A pilot Copilot, without the hyphen after the first pilot. So how many of you are running Copilot trials, for example? Right? So you've put you're putting those in place in your organization. Now I want you to think about the next step. How are you gathering the evidence together to work to say to yourself, is this working? I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but I want you to look at that. I want you to think about that critically for yourselves. Don't just come to the yes straight away. Think as we're moving forwards, because evidence isn't something that should be treated as an add-on. Evaluation shouldn't be something that's done after the event, nor is it something that's about bureaucracy. Evidence is about risk management. And that's what I'm hoping that you'll take from this today. Why do I say that? Well, I know a couple of people who are on the call were also at an event that I attended a few months ago. And this is a general feel that I get across the housing sector, but it was encompassed by somebody on a panel at a conference that I attended not so long ago. And he was trying to tell prop tech vendors that what they were selling to him, they had to prove worked. But when I challenged him and said, do you know what works at the moment? His response was, I don't know what works. I haven't got time to stop. I'm firefighting. And I appreciate it feels like firefighting in the housing sector at the moment. There are plenty of pressures that you're under from a variety of stakeholders, some who give a greater importance than maybe they should have in the grand scheme of things. So yes, the firefighting can feel real, but I'm going to tell you, if you work in housing at the moment, here's a reality check. That firefighting is often because what you think is a bucket of water is a bucket of oil that you keep throwing onto those flames and wonder why they're not dying down. That's because you haven't stopped. And the stop isn't to just down tools and do nothing, but it's a momentary pause to take stock of where you are, and in particular, work out what is and isn't working. And this comes back to the evidence. It's about not having sufficient or the right types of evidence in order to work out what is working. Because at the end of the day, what you have is a blind side, a blind spot that's been created. And that is the thing that is fueling the fires that you're trying to fight. And what I want to do, what I try and help clients do, is try and close those blind spots in practical ways. So that's where me being the curator of curiosity is about getting you to ask different questions and look for different evidence and data so that you can utilize it much more effectively and move forwards. I just wanted to give you this little quote that I came across at the weekend, which I think kind of sums up a lot of where we are, not just in housing, but in public services and in other business and industry areas, where we look for a lot of empiricism, and empiricism is seen as numbers. It's seen as the hard facts, the things that can be easily reported, and we take away the emotional side of things. Now, if you think this has come from an academic textbook, a politician, or a bit on the news, I'm going to surprise you now, because this is taken from this guy's autobiography. Some of you will be familiar with Mark Cavendish. Mark is Sir Mark Cavendish. He is the record stage winner of Tour de France stages. He started in a bank on the Isle of Man, and he's now kind of done quite well for himself. But I think he encapsulates it nicely that what we do is create disconnection by focusing just solely on the hard evidence, the numbers that we want to report. There's a nice story about Mark, actually. Mark was part of the British Cycling Olympic Academy back in the early 2000s. And I live in South Cheshire. Not far from me is North Staffordshire. He was climbing a hill up there on his bike called Gun Hill. I've ridden up it and it's horrible. He got off the bike, chucked it in the ditch and said, "That's it, I'm packing it in." The team coaches went and had a meeting at the end of this session. It was coming towards the end of the season. They all sat down, looked at Mark's numbers and went, "Yeah, well, his numbers don't stack up." One guy turned around and said, "Yeah, but Mark's got something different. Mark's got something that is is giving him that kind of that bit that is making him, it's giving him a magic power. It's something that he can use." And they took a risk and they took Mark on. And look at him now. He wouldn't have been the Tour de France record stage winner if it hadn't have been for somebody being able to get behind those immediate numbers. Because what we have is quantification fixation. And I think this is, we see this in society at large. I see it time and time again with housing clients. It's that quantification fixation. What do I mean by that? Here's a quick example for you. How many of you have these smart watches, and if you go out for a run or go to the gym and you forget to set it, that session never happens? Yeah, it's all about how do I quantify it? How do I get the numbers from this? Not how did I feel at the end of that run? And this leaks through. We see it in the housing sector with KPIs, increasingly with tenant satisfaction measures, where it's becoming a box ticking exercise. It's get across the line, fixate on that quantification to some extent, and I'm going to say it, some extent there is gaming of these things to try and get it across the line but there is a lack of learning from it. And again, I appreciate the pressure you're under, but it's about the learning that needs to take place. If your TSM measures are of a particular point, are you asking the next set of questions about what you need to do? What are those questions? Where might that data and insight and information exist? You know, you as a housing provider, you have many data points, you have touch points with your customers on a daily basis. One of the ones one of the things I'm always amazed at is how many housing providers don't talk to their electricians, plumbers, joiners who go into people's homes on a daily basis, because they're dismissed as just being an electrician, a plumber, or a joiner. What would they know? Yet they can find out a lot of information. It doesn't require more surveys. It requires intelligent use of information and of evidence. The second point, though, is the way in which often intelligence and data gathering is outsourced. You know, it's given to consultants to go and do it. I have erred away from calling myself a consultant because I've seen, you know, I feel bad about the way that consultants often act. They come in, they do a lot of work that could be done in-house. They charge, you know, quite exorbitant day rates some of the time, but what they leave clients with is a report. And that report becomes a bit like this thing. You know, we've all heard about the plane crash and the search for the black box. Why is it you look for the black box? They look for the black box because you didn't know what happened during the plane crash. We need to find the evidence to work out what happens. But the only way you find out what happens in that plane crash is by analysing what has gone on in the black box. If you don't know what is in the black box, you don't know how to access it, how to look at what is in the black box, you don't find the full story. And that often is like the consultants who come in and do the work around, for example, evaluation. They come in, they do an evaluation, they give you a report. The report says yes or no whether you've done what it is you said you've done, but what have you missed along the way? What's the rich information that you can get from this? You know, and as we move forward with AI, you know, particularly around large language models, you know, we've been talking before we started the call today about using ChatGPT. You know, how many people just put something into ChatGPT and think that what ChatGPT gives them is gospel? You know, I mean, I'm hoping I'm kind of speaking to the converted in some respects on this, that you do kind of check these things, you put guardrails in place, you have safeguards, and you understand that you've got to do some legwork up front and a lot of legwork afterwards to make use of what ChatGPT provides you in those few seconds after you've hit the return button. But where things like LLMs are being used as, you know, in the future to help housing organizations make decisions, to analyze data and evidence, you know, are we going to use it as an unquestioned authority, or are we using it as a decision support tool? In which case, how is that better embedded into the processes that you use? It's the same with evidence. You know, an LLM can help you analyze the evidence, can help you gather the evidence, but you still need to understand what is it I've got to get from this. Sorry. So I want to talk briefly about evaluation, because for me, evaluation is one of those things that I see in public services as being done very badly. I was interviewed for a project for evaluation last week. The tender brief was 2 pages long. It was put out on LinkedIn. Myself and a colleague responded to it. The big word that jumped out to us was they wanted a co-produced evaluation. We offered them a co-produced evaluation, which would utilize our expertise as people who've done evaluation, and then try and embed confidence, capacity, and capability back into that organization, helping them go out and collect the right data and information, helping them do the analysis because they're familiar with the program that they're running. What they actually wanted was people to come out and just be feet on the street and go and get the data for them. You know, it's not a co-produced evaluation. But equally, evaluation, which I feel bases itself around things like theory of change and logic models, misses the point. People get hung up on the titles. They lose sight of what it is an evaluation should do. So for me, evaluation, I want to strip it right back for you, should be a case of, if we do X, we expect Y to happen. Does it? In academic parlance, we're setting up a hypothesis and we're going out and testing it. That's what an evaluation can and should be. Forget the theory of change, forget the logic model, work out exactly what it is you're needing to find the evidence around. So let's replace that theory of change. Let's start to think about, well, what is it you're trying to improve? How do we notice if that is improving or not? What might get in the way around it? So here's my quick framework. And I've picked this picture in particular because it's not a straight A to B. I'm going to give you another example. So on my desk, have this jar of sweets. Yeah. Some of you will be familiar, and some of you might have heard me talk about this before. You might know of a guy called Donald Rumsfeld, who over 20 years ago talked about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And I will admit that at the time I thought he was barking mad. But then I had my Father Dougal moment one night and thought, oh my God, I know what he's on about. So my known is I have a jar of sweets. My known unknown is how many sweets are in that jar. So I want to find out how many sweets are in the jar. So I take off the lid of the jar, I tip out all of the sweets, and I decide to count them. But as I'm counting them, I find something very unexpected. I find I've got £20 that's hidden in the jar of sweets. I didn't know it was going to be there. And this is why this process is a bit like a winding road that we go along. What we do, we go seek to work out what is working. So let's start off. What is success? What does success mean to you? If you're running a pilot, what is it you are hoping this change that you are making is going to do? Secondly, can we measure it? And if so, how? What metrics do we need in order to do that? And the third thing coming from that, when we've collected those measures, what are those measures telling us? What is it we can learn from this? I did some work not so long ago for a Welsh housing association who are in the global 4-day week pilot. They approached me and they said to me, Rob, can you tell us, does 4-day week work for us? Which came as a bit of a shock, but illustrates my point about some of the consultants that are out there and some of the models that are being used, that the global 4-day week pilot seemingly doesn't tell individual participants how this is helping them. It looks at very globalized metrics and measures. It's very much like TSMs and KPIs. It's giving you the veneer, but doesn't get beneath it. So I worked with this housing association, and the first thing we did was identify what do they mean by success, and it meant a whole series of things. But for the board, it came down to something very simple. It was, are our tenants happy? Are our staff happy? Are we hitting our KPIs? And is it costing us any more money? So simple success measures that we then were able to measure. But the learning that took place around that, again, I call it the Father Dougal moment. Some of you will have watched Father Ted. Some of you might be familiar with Father Ted, but the Father Dougal moment is where Father Dougal, the more dim-witted of the priests, suddenly goes, ah! And it's the light bulb moment. And for them, it was the fact that the measures and the metrics that we had to measure the success of 4-day week weren't influenced solely by 4-day week. There were a whole myriad of different things going on, because again, gathering data, gathering evidence around pilots, around things that you are trying out to see if they work. You can't put them into test tubes like we would in a lab to do a randomized control trial. You know, you're living in a very live, dynamic environment where things are changing daily, where tenants want services provided, they want a response, where government is asking you to do more and different things every day, you know, where you've got other stakeholders who are putting pressures on. So we have to work out, well, to what extent is the thing that we're doing the thing that is making the change, and to what extent is are other things around it making those changes? And I'm going to tell you now, if anybody comes along and tells you you can isolate all of this and go hand on heart say, yeah, it's all down to that, well, good luck, pay them the money, because you'll be going back out and asking the same question again in a few months or a few years. It's impossible. It comes down to gut feeling. It comes down to taking all of these things in the round, both the quantitative and the qualitative information that you can gather there, to come to some kind of better judgment. Because unfortunately, we live in an imperfect world. You know, you've only got to look at the BBC News webpage this morning to realise that this world is not perfect. So we don't have perfect information. What we can do, though, is start to fill some of the gaps. And by filling those gaps, gain greater confidence in the decisions we're making. And in making those decisions, appreciate that there are still things that we need to keep our eye on as we move forwards. You know, we don't reach to a point where we can go, yeah, that's great, let's sign it off. I'm 100% certain that that's working, and yeah, it will carry on working. It's always about the kind of, how do we get through the short term with an eye to the medium term, knowing that the long term is something that is kind of 100 different pictures. It's almost like quantum physics. So if you were doing an AI pilot, for example, how would you, how might you do it? So you're running a co-pilot in your organization, you know, and I've heard and seen people talk about this in various ways, from very small things to enormous changes. If you were to do this though, I'd be looking at this. I'd start to say, well, how do we constrain the scope of a pilot? How do we get this into some kind of manageable form? You know, if I roll it out across the organization in one go, there's going to be lots of hairs running. The dynamics around it are going to be massive. How do I constrain some of those dynamics so I can start to see, how much of is this pilot making a difference? So I'll constrain that scope. So maybe I'll adopt, you know, one team at a time. Maybe we'll focus it around one particular task. And how do we put, you know, we'll put in a short time window. Maybe we'll run it for 3 months. But over those 3 months, we want to gather insight and intelligence quickly, so that we can see where those changes are being made before we get to the end of 3 months and realize we've spent time and money on something that was clearly never going to work in the first place, and we could have had early signs back. You know, choose a small set of signals. You know, you want your qualitative stuff. You know, it might be reduction in time taken with tenant calls to a call center. You know, it could be the volume of something. It could be the you know, how many what the error rate is. For example, if you use employing AI to help you define you know, repair tasks. Can you give a quantitative get quantitative data about how that has led you to much better decisions, or for the operative to go out and have a clearer idea of what the problem is to start off with. But then equally, what are the qualitative measures that you're going to use there? Where's the qualitative data around, you know, staff experience, tenant stories that come back from it? How can you bring those two together and marry both the qualitative and the quantitative? Think of it as the quant being the black and white, and the qualitative gives you that color. It's the stuff that brings that pilot to life. Decide, you know, what your learning question is. You know, for example, with AI, are we reducing effort, or are you just relocating it somewhere else? Is that what you want to learn from it? And then create a feedback loop. So if those, you know, if the signals are moving, what is it you are going to do in response to it? How will you change? And that doesn't mean saying it hasn't worked, let's sweep it under the carpet, forget we did it, and hope that nobody sees the dead body. It's using this as a genuine learning opportunity. It's saying, what do we learn by doing it? And some of that is in the detail. So that's where it's important to get that qualitative side, because that is where you're going to get many of the learning points from, because they give you that color. So that's where things like co-produced evaluation are going to be essential. You know, get the expertise in that can help you to build those evaluation frameworks which are meaningful to you. Get the expertise in which will help you, you know, understand what measures you can be employing, how to bring that, how to gather that data, where you might find that data from. But don't go out and get a consultant to come in, just write you an evaluation framework, get them to do all the data collection, crunch the numbers, give you a report, and hope that that report will illuminate the things that you will learn by doing many of these things yourself or in partnership with your evaluation partner. Think about the systems that this fits within. You know, I've talked about the way in which we can't isolate and control for many of these things. It's understanding how they fit back into the bigger picture of your business, of your organization. So think in the system, don't be engineers. Don't just think, oh, that bit's failed, I'll take it out, slot the new bit in and hope that it works. I've seen that many times, and I've seen how it fails. It comes back to the blind spots. It comes back to the prove that your thing works. If you don't know what isn't working, how can you hope to plug in an alternative? And how can you hope to plug it into an environment where it needs to be able to fit and work with other systems, other things that are working alongside it? You know, and by adopting this approach, this is about embedding, as I said, confidence, capability, and capacity within your business to enhance that continual improvement. You know, we talk a lot about continual improvement. You know, you get management consultants talk about it. For me, it comes back to having some of these basics in place. It's about culture and changing some of the culture. It's about making sure the evidence becomes, like I said, part of risk management, about quality assurance, and then focusing on, well, how can we get that in more pain-free ways? The first thing is, a pain-free way is not paying somebody from one of the big four consultants, thousands of pounds per day to come in and advise you on something that they don't really know what is going on. You know, you have a lot of things at your fingertips. Your challenge at the moment is sometimes you can't see them, and that's natural. You know, it's the lost in plain sight. You know, I do that all the time. I was helping a mate of mine who's a joiner this week, you know, and we were looking for his hammer, and it was sat there on top of the toolbox, which kept walking past several times. You know, that's the same with you for data, information, intelligence. There's lots of it there. Sometimes it's just being able to pinpoint it. Sometimes you need sort of critical friend. Sometimes you just need somebody to come in and hold your hand, put their arm around you, go, yeah, come on, you can do it. Have you looked over in that drawer? Have you looked in that cupboard? Have you looked in those files there? This is the way in which you can start to make some of these things part and parcel of your business, so that instead of being a cost, they become an investment and they pay back time and time again. Because if you don't do that, you're going to be back to the firefighting. But coming back to my thing at the start, you're not trained as firefighters, you're not equipped as firefighters, and most of the time you're trying to put out this blaze with a fire extinguisher, and the fire extinguisher just ain't good enough. So stop firefighting by starting to get control of some of the things you have got control over, one of which is about evidence, one of which is about, it's about gathering information, intelligence, turning it into knowledge, and building that knowledge and making it wisdom. That's the gold dust for you. I come back to the example I gave you right at the start, where you dismiss some things because you don't think that that's the right thing to do it. And, I'm going to, said to Guy, I'd be a bit provocative today. have the courage to say that the old model is not working. Can we try something different? This is the pilot for you. You know, because the cost of not knowing, it's a false confidence. It's the feeling that you think you know where you're going, but do you really know where you're going? And when you don't end up where you thought you were ending up, it's a bit, you know, it's embarrassing at best. But there's worse. You know, you can end up wasting money and time. You can continue to have customers who feel like your services are not meeting their needs and continue to give you, you know, poor TSMs. But equally, it's about, you know, repeating those mistakes not only waste that time and resource, it actually makes people who work in your organization start to feel, well, why the hell are we doing? You know, the confidence within the organization goes down. People's, you know, morale drops, all from not being able to, you know, not taking this thing about evidence seriously and then harnessing it for improvement within businesses, within organizations. So I'm going to leave you with some kind of final messages, and then I'm hoping that I've given you enough to think about, that we can have a bit of a discussion for the rest of the session. Evidence isn't about certainty. Yeah, I've tried to illustrate that. I can't, you know, nobody can deliver you perfect information and 100% assurance through gathering evidence. But what it is about is being less wrong sooner. It's the old adage about fail fast, learn faster, and adapt quicker. And I think that's, you know, that's where a different approach to gathering evidence, particularly around piloting and evaluation, will take you a long, long way towards doing some of this. So I know this is, you know, you're all interested in AI, and again, this is where I will illustrate the consultant thing. I don't know what many of you are doing around AI. I'm learning. What my kind of superpower is around, you know, kind of information, about asking questions, about gathering information and data. So my question to you is, what is one AI-enabled activity that you're already doing or you're already piloting that you could start to learn from properly? And if you're going to do that on the basis of what I just talked about this morning, what's the one thing you'll go away after this meeting and think, yeah, I'm going to go and do that? And on the flip side, what's stopping you doing that? Because let's try and get some things in place so that you can go and do that one thing this afternoon. So I'll turn the screen off now, guys.
And you'll be able to see people. Thank you very much, Rob. There were lots of people paying lots of attention, so that was really great. I think I'd quite like to just summarize back some of this to check that I've kind of got a bit of a framework from your brain and managed to embed it in mine. So stop firefighting, start getting control over information, turn that into knowledge and then into wisdom. That's sort of like a bit of an intro for it. Tips for pilots: constrain the scope aggressively. So that might be one team, one task, really short time period. Do a quant and qual data around it, co-producing an evaluation framework. And then consider what we're doing with AI. Like, are we relocating or reducing effort? What's this doing in that context? And then fourth, creating a feedback loop for that.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that, given on that summary you've just given me, because obviously AI is a very emotive topic at the moment. You know, to some extent, we get a very binary view of it, particularly across the popular media, that it's either the best thing since sliced bread or it's the end of the world. You know, and I like Ridley Scott's quote about life isn't black and white, it's lived in a million shades of grey. I think it's the grey areas that we really need to be teasing out. You know, so when we talk about AI adoption, you know, I was at an event that you were speaking at, Guy, at the end of last year for the Disruptive Innovators Network, you know, and we saw there There's concern by trade unions in housing that, this is going to be the end of jobs. We've got evidence from other business sectors. Well, actually, it's not about the end of jobs. It's about augmentation. It's of roles. It's about adaptation of staff to those new roles and changing kind of responsibilities that go with it. But on the flip side, also it takes away some of those things on your day-to-day to-do lists, which you kind of keep ending up on the to-do list further and further down because you want to put it off because you don't like doing it. So with all of these things, it's looking for those grey areas, Guy, to try and find out, what's working, what isn't working, why isn't it working, where's the detail within this?
Yep. And you also mentioned some of the systems thinking bit about how these pilots are interacting with the wider thing. So can I open up questions? So I appreciate you pitched a question to people, and it would be great to hear some of those things and about whether people have got some actionable stuff they might be able to take away. I can't help but think about our sector risk profile. So like in England, we've got data integrity way up there. We've had this for a really long time. Better Social Housing Review a long while back brought this up. It's still there. We've still got really crap data. And again, the systems thinking thing, we've got pretty poor data and digital literacy. So the cognitive tooling to be able to do the kind of navigation of the grey areas, I guess I'm kind of concerned, or actually I've received the opposite of assurance that the sector is capable of delivering that. So how do we start to move that needle?
Well, I think the first thing is, Guy, the sector itself is not starting with it's not being curious enough to ask the questions it needs to ask. And I think that's because as a sector, and I've said it in public before, and I will say it again, I don't think the sector is bold enough in kicking back at some of the stakeholders who think they have greatest importance. I'll give the example of the announcement of 38 million extra for the new homes programme last year. The sector it's a bit like Ted and Ralph, that the government kind of offers 38 million as Ralph without really much clue beyond the grand gesture, and doesn't really understand how that's going to be delivered, and the sector doffs its cap instead of saying, well, how are we going to deliver 38, how are we going to deliver those new homes with that funding, based on the fact that also equates to around 120 million that's got to be borrowed on the open market, at the same time as there are policies and regulatory practices which work against the asset sheet. The EPCC coming in a few years is a big part of that, and having to house the riskiest customers here we're going. So again, doesn't really stack up in terms of that one part of the policy. The questions it starts to then need to ask is, are the KPIs that we've got the right ones? I'll go back to the example that I did with the Housing Association in South Wales. Around 4-day week, the work we did led us into a second phase, which was about creating a performance framework for the business, which was focused on KPIs that mattered to them. It's not to say the KPIs that are collected by the regulator aren't important, but some of them are not of primary importance to you as a business from the off. They muddy the waters at best. A lot of the time, it's you can't see the wood for the trees. A lot of the time, many a client has said to me, "Look, Rob, I'm drowning in data. Don't get me any more data." So the first thing is about making sense of some of the things that you already have. The second thing is about making sense of what are the gaps that need to be filled. So, for example, I get this. You get this a lot from housing providers, where they'll say, well, these tenant satisfaction surveys are a waste of time, and to some extent, I will agree with it. Tenant satisfaction surveys are a bit of a waste of time, because they should only be confirming what you know already through those other data points that you have as a business. However, it's a given. You've got to do it. You've got to spend the money. That's it. If you've got to do it, you've got to spend the money. You've got that opportunity. Then what's the next set of questions you need to be asking whilst you've got a captive audience? You know, if you know that your repair service is not up to what your tenants expect, you know that you're going to get a low score on it. What's the next set of questions you want to know around that? You know, you're not gathering information in a very representative way, I will say, from those tenant satisfaction surveys. I've looked at how they're collated. They come through telephone surveys, and whilst market research companies will tell you they are representative based on the demographics, they are not representative based on the behaviours of your customers. Because my first question after that is, how many customers didn't answer the phone, or immediately when they were told it was a survey for X housing association, put the phone down? Secondly, how many of those people got through all 55 questions? A friend of mine sent me a survey from his local authority last year. He said, what do you think of this survey question, Rob? It was do people, to what extent do you agree or disagree? People of different ethnicities get on in this area. I said, well, there's a question. It's kind of, technically it's fine. It's a bit, it's like, how many questions have you got there? 55. Right, are they all pretty much like this? Yes, they're all pretty much like this. Does it mention potholes anywhere? No. And I know, I live in a neighbouring authority. We share a problem with potholes. Everybody has an issue with potholes. It set a chain of things running where this local authority had no hope of addressing any of them. They were all bland, they were all mundane, they were all at high level. They know that it's only a certain group of people who are responding to this paper copy survey, and then a subsection of those are going to get to question 55 in the resident conversation. So what is that about engagement? It's pretty futile. But if you're a housing provider, and like I said, you know that you have got a captive audience here, you know that your tenant satisfaction on a particular part of your service is low because you've got those other data points. What is, ask them the next set of questions about what it is that that tenant, which part of the service is it that they're dissatisfied with it with, get into a little bit more detail on that. What would they like to see from that service that would make an improvement? Again, it's not perfect information, but it gives you the next steps. And I think, Guy, that's where we're taking, that's your question. It's moving it away from the quantification fixation around these high level, often very kind of becoming esoteric data, points of governance, and getting into the nitty gritty about what is and isn't working. And then what can I do about it to make the change?
Yeah, I think that's a good shout, to use some of the regulatory architecture to use that to actually gather evidence and to listen to the customer, which is what the regulator is trying to force to happen through what it's doing. It's just that potentially it's seen as being a regulatory thing rather than a listening / evidence gathering thing.
I kind of get the sense, Guy, that in the sector it's the ombudsman who's being more mature in terms of having this conversation with providers than it is the regulator. Who I maybe I don't want. Yeah, all right. I'm going to castigate it in that way. That for me, the regulator seems to be quite happy to create league tables, like most regulators in industries across the UK. It seems less interested in as I said, the qualitative side of the journey that housing providers are taking. And I think, this is where I come back to the firefighting, because I appreciate you are all under pressure from a lot of different directions. And I think the way in which the regulator approaches this is not helping with those pressures. I think they could be a lot more curious, and they could work in conjunction with and and partner with housing providers rather than being seen, to some extent as a bogeyman. And I think that's about maturity. I think that's about, having that curiosity and helping housing providers have the confidence to ask their next set of questions, rather than having a quantification fixation, which leads to a gamification, and then a hope that some of the other things behind it won't be found out. Because by doing that, we just kind of end up with the bodies are under the rug. We can see they're there, and eventually we're going to trip up over them.
Thanks, Rob. So are there any questions from people? So we've had quite a lot here. So Tim, fire away.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Rob. That was really interesting. It's prompted a few thoughts from me that AI, like other former technologies, has a lot of things in common with those. But to me, it seems it has some differences in how we evaluate it. So, you know, previous next big things like ERP and CRM, people evaluated, they trialed them, and didn't really do the work in parallel with that to figure out how are we going to manage the benefits delivery? Do we have the procurement skills? How do we architecturally control these things? Blah, blah, blah. And when you look back, so many of those technologies didn't deliver the benefits. And I get what you're saying about quantification, but ultimately, some of your benefits have to be hard numbers. So I think that is something it has in common with AI. But the things that strike me as a bit different with AI is it's a volatile, moving thing. You had some great analogies, so I'm going to try one of my own. It's a bit like you get a puppy for 6 weeks and you go, oh, that was great. We'll have one of those. And then 6 months later, it bites someone's face off. And I think that the risks presented by AI are ever changing. So if it works now in one environment, that's weak evidence that it's going to be safe in a different environment within the business 6 months down the line. I'm not sure how we deal with that level of uncertainty and risk. And I'm a board member, how we convince the board that that's all being managed. And then the other thing is to have net benefits. Obviously, you need to have a grip of your costs. And the costs of AI, to me, seem very volatile. So at the moment, it's quite early on, and there are sort of teaser rates, so it's sort of free to use. You get people dependent on it without paying anything for it, and there's an unprecedented amount of venture capital has been invested in this. There's obviously going to be massive pressure on people to hit their sales targets, which will impact on us. We might not have the procurement skills, so the cost of it seems to me very volatile. So it feels like a very difficult pitch to the board to say, yeah, we've tried it, we know how to manage it, and we know what to look like in the future.
Okay, thanks for those, Tim, because I think you raised some really interesting points. I mean, I'll pick up the first one about that kind of changing dynamic, because I think, you know, I appreciate that, and I think that's what I was hoping to try and kind of convey this morning, was that thing that any kind of pilot or evaluation, for me, I mean, I've been involved in them where you're brought in after the thing has started to evaluate, and the first thing you can ask is, where's your you can create as a baseline. Well, I can't, because it's 6 months in and you never collected any, you didn't understand what you were trying to evaluate back then, so that moment's gone. But at the same time, you kind of, like I said, so often ends with a report, like you said, that gets presented with oh yeah, this will work. And then the adoption of that report is, oh, that's fine, that works everywhere. Instead of, well, no, this work, you know, it's all the health warnings that people need to appreciate around it. And I think that's where working with I like to work with clients, because it's that ability to try and, like I said, it's the capability, and part of that capability is going, right, okay, we're running a pilot, we're doing it in this situation with these variables that exist at the moment. With all of that, yeah, it worked in this situation. It might work elsewhere, but we'll need to test that. And at the same time, I think it's that constant review mentality to be able to say it's working at the moment, but like you said, with AI, it's an ever-changing environment. Is it, 6 months down the line, is it still working? But being able to embed those feedback loops in at an early stage, having providers have the confidence, the capability, and the capacity to keep doing that themselves, I think is the important part here. So, my philosophy is in what I do now is, it's like I can give somebody a fish and he's satisfied today, or I can teach you how to fish, and then you can keep on going and feeding yourself. And that's that in there. That for me is part of the answer to that, is building that capability back in, to enable that kind of constant review. I think in terms of the cost thing, I've got no kind of easy response on that other than to come back to this is something that is under constant review, that you can trial something now, but that thing might look very different in 6 months time, 12 months time. So do you have to change what it is you're trialing, and then go back, but it's not going back to square one. It's building on what you've already got, understand how that has changed, look at moving it forwards, and then the cost. Well, I don't know how you deal with cost.
Just picking up quickly on your point about consultants, I think it's really a skill in how you manage them. And back from my lecturing days, one definition of learning is an enduring change in behaviour. So that's what you're seeking. You're not seeking a report, you're seeking an enduring change of behaviour in the organisation.
I think, but that's a cultural step change I think we need to make across the sector, because it's it's moving away from the black box thinking and the contracting out, and embedding the thinking back into the business, in helping people be intelligent consumers of those consultancy services, to go, actually, I need that expertise. That's great. There are times you want the independence of somebody to come in, and that is, that is fine, but retain control and ownership of the thinking. Don't contract that out, because that's where, like you said, Tim, that's the learning part is all there. That's the bit you really need to be kind of having that, keeping within the business.
Thanks, Rob. I can see Scott's got a question. I'll switch off.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a sort of observation and a question, that the point about the quantification, fixation, that very similar thing came up a few weeks ago, and I was listening to a Forrester thing. They do sort of annual predictions about stuff. This is about customer experience, and they're basically saying that loads of people are really fixed on their numbers, and they're not actually fixed on customer experience. It becomes the thing that they're chasing, and actually it's a proxy. And if you're focusing on the customer experience, those numbers will take care of themselves. But the other thing was about sort of evaluation stuff and about baselines. So and one of the things I've found when I was an IT manager, and then when I'm now the dreaded C word, the consultant, is people will go, yeah, we want 80% of our customers reporting repairs online. And you're like, okay, so how many are doing at the moment? Don't know. Do you measure activity on? Oh, do we? Don't know. And so, I mean, there are cases where it's easy because the baseline is 0, right? And you're just trying to do something. But where it isn't, I suppose the question is, how have you found ways to get people better at realizing that if they're going to go for a target, they need to know where they are now?
No, in a short word. I think that's a conversation that carries on with some of them. Some are better than others, and you'll appreciate it, Scott, as a consultant, that you kind of work, different. There's different cultures in different organisations. So there are those who never change. It doesn't matter what you do, say, or how much they pay you; they will just carry on regardless. There are others, like the housing association in Wales that did around the 4-day week. They're culturally, they were happy to take, happy to ask the questions, and be challenged back. And I think that's the thing. It's being prepared to be challenged back. That do you know these things? No, that's not a failing. But if we're gonna move forward, let's establish that first. And this is why, reflecting on a few things that I've gone for and kind of open tender in the last sort of year and a bit, where it's that parachuting in with that expectation that everything and can be like the key in the door. You just suddenly come in and unlock it. And it's like, yeah, but I'm a Yale lock. I'm a Yale key, and what you've got is a mortise lock there. So we've got to find some way that we can work with this, not around it, but work with it. Again, I think it's that procurement process, which seems to be the let's go out, get 3 different quotes, and go for the one that's cheapest. Let's move away from that, get a bit more mature, and start to find the people that who you can work with, who you kind of can challenge you, but equally want to work with you when you're housing providers, to start to say, yeah, okay, let's work out how we get through this. So I could have gone into a few of these things and come up with an evaluation framework, got it out of the briefcase, given it to them, said, let's just do this and we'll be able to tick the boxes at the end. That's, in some respects, that's fine. It gets them through the process. It does what it needs to do bureaucratically. Have they learned from it? Probably not, because I don't really understand the program that it is they're running. Scott, if you're going in as an IT consultant, you'll arrive there and go, well, what I had on paper is very different to what I'm seeing when I'm here. Now we need, actually, let's be realistic about it. We'll need to adjust it. It's like going on a journey in the car, isn't it? You can put it in, you can look at a map and go, right, well, I can get from A to B by going along these roads and round here, and suddenly you end up in a huge traffic jam, or there's a road closed, or something happens. You've got to make alterations along the way. It doesn't mean you don't get to B, but you have to do it in a slightly different way. But I think that's the maturity, isn't it, about doing that? But yeah, I think having some of those questions is difficult.
Cool. So we're pretty much at time now, unfortunately. There's a couple of questions from Scott, who's the eCumry one on this call, that are in the chat, but I think they're quite substantive questions. So perhaps,
I can stay on, Guy. That's fine.
Oh, grand. Okay. So if you need to leave, I'll just do a reminder now that we've got a hackathon. So if you're signed up for the hackathon on the 26th of Feb in Manchester, that's happening. And so this is including some tenants, and we're going to be building some, like, vibe coding some software together, trying to make something cool. And then our next online session, which will be on the 6th of March, we'll be sharing the outputs from that, and we will be sharing our learnings about the method. So again, this kind of like evidence thing, we're going to build some stuff, show you what we've built, which will be more than zero, and we'll be reflecting on that process, whether that has actually done what we wanted it to do. So hopefully that's of interest, but we'll continue on, but we'll probably sort of, like, if you need to leave, then you've got to leave. So cheers. So yeah, Scott's questions. So do organizations in reality actually measure the costs, etc., of implementing, of like evaluating pilots? And what is going on in the sector in terms of like identifying and agreeing on pilots? Is it just like whatever the lead person fancies, or are they going off the risk register? How are they measuring resources, etc.? So some of the kind of governance and sort of procurement bits in there, I think.
Good questions, and I don't have the answers to them, but I'd be interested to see how that's what people are doing around that. I think in terms of that wider learning, I would say that there isn't enough learning, particularly around the kind of the nitty gritty about what actually happens. The sector is very good at sharing what it sees as good practice. It likes to parachute in things that worked somewhere else, and people adopt it without understanding the context in which it worked in the one place. So, again, it comes back to both the quantitative and the qualitative side of things in that. It's probably one of the biggest regrets of my career is writing good practice guides, because as you get older, you start to realize there was a fallacy in the way in which some of them are adopted. The one that always sticks in my mind was Gold Service that Irwell Valley Housing Association created back in the late 90s, which fitted a particular set of circumstances and was sort of led by a chief executive who had a particular philosophy, but was adopted almost universally across England by housing providers, and many of them went, yeah, it didn't quite work. It didn't quite work because you didn't understand where the origins of Gold Service were, how it evolved in a particular organisation, what the learning points were as they went along. And again, that's why I come back to evaluations pilots need to be embedded back into businesses, and it's about doing a lot of these things internally with external help where it's needed. In terms of those costs, I think again it's probably looking at the wrong type of costs. I haven't got examples of this, but if anybody does, then we can look at it individually. But it's the bottom line isn't always the true cost, is it? It's looking at the bigger picture and what are the costs and benefits in the wider system. Yeah, having X Copilot licenses might cost X £1,000, but how do you measure the costs and the benefits to the wider business? We've just seen that last week that the Treasury's changed the Green Book rules, or is changing the Green Book rules. There's that kind of architecture and infrastructure in which we appreciate that, but equally it comes back to culture within individual organizations, about saying what are the costs and benefits and how do we measure them. And some of them aren't going to be immediate pounds and pence. It's about understanding, well, what are the other things that we can measure, which we can use as proxies for those pounds and pence, because they deliver something else elsewhere. And we can kind of put a notional cost around it.
I can probably just add a little bit to this, because I work with lots of providers on this sort of topic, Scott. So it's really heterogeneous. So there's loads of different ways that people are trying to govern and get value from AI. I would say probably the most common is that it's the IT director that's sort of leading it in some sense. And they haven't included an evaluation or any kind of cost of that sort. They've really only thought about the licenses. If you're lucky, they've thought about training, but they probably haven't. And that's the way it's going. There are other organizations where it's like, okay, what's our corporate strategy? Where are we at culturally and in terms of our data integrity, and where can we make use of the technology available? But that's like a little bit exceptional at this point.
But equally, that fits back into, where does this fit within the wider business? And I think sometimes that site is lacking. It comes back to the what is working, what isn't working. If you just take it on the engineering approach of that is broken, we'll take that bit out and plug something else back in. It might work in that kind of silo, but across the piece, it doesn't fit. The work I did with the Housing Association on 4-day week, where we started to talk about performance framework. One of the things illustrated that one part of the service was like running projects and addressing what they saw as problems, which nobody else across the business did. Yet everybody else in the business was going, I've got this problem and I need them to help me out with it. And it was that kind of, that siloing is another blind spot. It's the, well, how do we look at that wider system? It's not, we always say, what is it? Tony Blair came in 1997 and talked about, holistic thinking, joined up government and holistic thinking. And, we're kind of almost 30 years on and we haven't really moved anywhere closer to it. We just kind of, and it's, but I think it comes back to the quantification, but it comes back to the pounds and pence. Everybody keeps control of their own budgets, and therefore, well, if it impacts on my budget, well, I've got to be able to do these things. Not, well, how do we globalize this across the business to look at the benefits across the piece, because that's the big picture is what we need to be working towards.
Cool. Do we have any other burning questions for Rob?
I didn't have a question. I was just going to sort of that sort of point about housing association, my experience, are generally pretty bad at change of any kind of sort, but some of it is about kind of understanding your own capabilities and culture. And that Drucker quote about culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I've got into organizations that are like, yeah, we want to do this great kind of Microsoft Dynamics implementation or whatever, and you kind of have to say to them in a constructive way, your organization is not mature enough to handle this. It's in some cases you have to sort of translate your basket case into some constructive things, and it's like so I think there's, and that's not necessarily just a housing thing, but it does sort of stop it stops momentum, it slows down. Because people are like,
for me, Scott, it comes, the first thing is about confidence. I look at the housing sector in particular. It's the confidence to ask different questions is sometimes about, and I will say that what I see part of my role when I'm working with a client is I'll put my arm around them and go, look, it's all right. You can ask this question. You might not want to hear the answer, but actually you need to hear the answer. But it's not a disaster, because it's the tool that you then use to then put the next set of building blocks in place. But by ignoring it, you're not going to achieve what it is you want to achieve overall. So yeah, firstly it's the confidence. Secondly, it's a capability. And I mean, when it comes to my stuff with research, and I try not to use the word research because so many people just see it as something that they don't do, they don't need, or it's something that's an add-on when they've got the time or the money that's available for them to go and get somebody to come and do it for them. But what I like to see is, it's like when I say to, my wife says to me, what are we going to have for tea tonight? That's research. Firstly, we've got to go, right, okay, what do we fancy having tonight? Well, there's the various options. What have we got in the fridge and the cupboard? Right, those options are off. Right, we've got an 11-year-old who's a fussy eater and a pain in the arse at times, and you go, well, okay, those ones are off as well. So now we're down to 3 options. Although we've done some research there, but we've done it in a way, we've adopted that process that can get us to a solution at the end. And at the end of it, we'll go, we cooked that tea. God, it wasn't that great, was it? Wouldn't do it again. So it comes back to Tim's thing about, well, how does life change? How does the world change? Well, life changes, so you just adapt to it. But it's being able to constantly adapt. So then that's, so you've got the research side. I've had conversations with people, sort of senior people across the sector, in trade bodies, in various organisations, who say we don't need any research training. Yeah, it's like I said, like, and Guy's highlighted, first thing I get is, well, I'm drowning in data, Rob, but I don't know. So we've got a research problem, but let's not call it a research problem. Let's understand it about, about gathering evidence, about understanding what the world around you, the context you're in, and the possibilities that you've got moving forward. How do we know whether things are working? How do we know whether the things we're going to try will work? How do we keep on doing that, so that we create that capability? Some skills, ability to understand what tools are available to people that they can start to do some of this, the capability to say, to Scott as a consultant, look, Scott, I need you to come in and do this. I mean, the times I've been employed on research projects, and this was when I was working at universities as a consultant. And you come in and do the things that you think, well, hang on a minute, you could have been doing a lot of this stuff. And actually the bit that you really needed me for, we could have done all of this. We could have expanded that by spending the money there. And we could have got so much more. But you got me to do the thing that you could have done in-house. So again, it's the reallocation of resources and refocusing. But I think the biggie, Scott, like you say, is that can we leave them with something where they can carry on doing things? And I'm happy to go back to any client, but frankly, I don't want them to call me and get me to do the same thing again next year. I'd like to go in and do a different thing with them because I like working with them. I'd like to go to the next level. It might be something in a different part of the business. But I'd like to feel like I've left them with something as an investment the first time around. And yeah, okay, get me in the following year and I'll kind of hold your hand a little bit more, or check something over and cost you a lot less. But that's the way I feel. That's the way that we could be moving towards. And luckily, Guy and I was talking about this before. We know other consultants who kind of have that similar philosophy, and that's nice. What I think I was scared of the C word, because it's like the big fours who kind of walk around, charge lots of money, but you think, hang on, what have you actually delivered here in terms of any change? And maybe that's just my ethos and moral compass, but I don't want to be like that.
I'd agree with that. I think I think I always kind of aim to be, it's like, well, if they're going to employ me, it's because I can add some value. I can do something they can't do, or they need some sort of independent view on something. Yeah. And yeah, the sort of the old model of the consultant who saves you almost enough money to pay his fee is not really where where you want to be, really, where I want to be anyway.
Well, my approach, Scott, I always, I say to anybody, right, I start with a brief. You can book online with me, have half an hour, we can talk about stuff. I'll hopefully leave you with something, but that's not cost you anything, it's not cost me anything, and we find out where we are.
Yeah.
And with some of them, straight after that half hour, you think this isn't going to work ever. No. But that's all right, because we wasted half an hour, a bit of a chat, and that's it. But then other times it leads to that, actually, what you've come along and asked me about, it wasn't that immediate pain point. It was about something else. And actually, by having that half an hour, we've got to that point and we go, right, actually, should we have another session? Should we do something around that? And that's wonderful. That, again, is where we get to that learning. We get to the insights, and that's where, clients that I've worked with who've done that have found they've had kind of lasting change as a result of it.